My name is Hannah Brooks. I am 29 years old, and 2 days before my wedding, my parents handed me an ultimatum in a cold, fluorescent-lit church dressing room. My mother was adjusting the lace on my sleeve, her fingers dry and smelling of expensive hand cream, when my father closed the heavy oak door behind him. He didn't raise his voice. He never does. He just leaned against the vanity, smoothed the front of his tailored suit, and told me that if my grandfather sat at the head table, they would walk out of the rehearsal right then, and they wouldn't be attending the wedding on Saturday. "Take your grandfather off the head table, Hannah," he said, straightening his cuffs like the sentence itself needed ironing. "He's a retired janitor. He embarrasses us." That janitor packed my school lunches for 11 years, but my family thought the worst thing that could happen at my reception was 200 guests seeing a man with calloused hands sitting beside the bride. They were wrong. What happened when my father's CEO set down his champagne glass, buttoned his jacket, and walked across that crowded ballroom floor is something my parents never saw coming, and to be honest, even I didn't know the half of it. Welcome back to Hidden Chapters, where family secrets come to light and quiet people finally get their say. Every week we share stories about standing your ground with the people who share your name. If you believe the ones who raised you deserve the seat of honor, you are in the right place. Drop a comment below to let me know where you are watching from, and be sure to subscribe, because this story does not end where you think it does. I was 7 years old the summer my parents moved to Columbus. My father, Richard, had landed a mid-level management job at Meridian Freight Systems, a trucking and logistics company with 12,000 employees and a glass tower headquarters that he talked about the way some people talk about cathedrals. My mother, Linda, went with him to start her real estate career, selling houses to other people who were on their way up the corporate ladder. I stayed behind in Dayton with my grandfather, Walter, because they told me it was just for a year, sweetheart, just until we get settled and find the right school district. But 1 year turned into elementary school, which turned into middle school, which eventually became my entire childhood. My grandfather's house was a small, 2-bedroom ranch on the south side of Dayton. It smelled of lemon floor wax, black coffee, and the faint, sweet scent of tobacco from a pipe he hadn't actually smoked since my grandmother passed away in the 80s. Dinner was on the table at 6 sharp every single night, whether the world cooperated or not. Grandpa was the head custodian at Garfield Elementary, which happened to be the school I attended from kindergarten through 6th grade. Every single evening, after the last yellow bus pulled out of the gravel lot and the teachers had gone home to their families, I would sit at a desk in the back of his little office, doing my spelling homework while he finished his final rounds. And every night, when he pulled those heavy double front doors shut and turned the brass key in the lock, he would look back at the quiet building and say the same words like a prayer with a mop handle in it. "Leave every room better than you found it, kiddo." He said it when I spilled blue poster paint all over the art room floor and had to stay late to scrub the linoleum until my knees ached. He said it when I accidentally broke Mrs. Petty's classroom window with a stray softball and spent the next 3 months pulling weeds in her garden to earn the $38 for the glass. He said it so often, and so quietly, that I eventually stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing the sound of your own heartbeat. It was just the background noise of my life. My parents drove down from Columbus every couple of months to see us. I want to be fair to them, they never missed a birthday, and they always send a check for Christmas. But their visits never felt like family coming home. They felt like inspections. My father would sit at our worn kitchen table, wearing his weekend polo shirts that looked like they'd been ironed with a ruler, and review my report cards the way he reviewed quarterly freight numbers, looking for the slight dips in my math grades. Every time they got back into their clean, silver sedan to drive back to Columbus, my mother would pause on the porch, glance back at Grandpa's little house, and sigh. She looked at the clean gutters, the straight fence, the flag hanging by the front door, and the small patch of green yard with the exact same expression she used when she was looking at a listing she knew she couldn't move. I didn't have a name for that look when I was 9 years old. I have one now. It was shame. You have to understand the dynamic of my family to understand how we got to that church dressing room. My father is 54 now, the vice president of regional operations at Meridian, and he is a man who believes that presentation is a moral imperative. My mother is 52, a top-producing luxury realtor with her face on billboards along Route 23 and a laugh she saves exclusively for clients who are pre-approved for seven-figure mortgages. They aren't physically cruel people. They don't scream, and they don't throw things. They are worse than cruel in a way that is hard to explain to people who didn't grow up in it. They keep score. Love in my parents' house was a scoreboard. Grades were points. Colleges were points. Job titles were the playoffs. When I was 22, I called them to share what I thought was wonderful news. I had passed the postal exam and gotten a permanent route in Dayton. It came with federal benefits, a pension, a strong union, and honest, steady work on a street where the residents actually knew my name and left me bottles of cold water in July. I remember sitting on my grandfather's porch, holding the acceptance letter, feeling like I had finally built a solid foundation for myself. When I told my father on the phone, the line went dead silent for a long, heavy moment. I could hear the faint rustle of papers on his end. Then, he said, "And you're happy telling people that?" He didn't yell. He just filed me somewhere lower on the scoreboard, moved on to the next topic, and never asked about my job again. My mother mailed me a gray blazer a week later, with a note suggesting I wear it for interviews when I decided to look for a real career. I wore it once, to a neighbor's funeral, and then let it gather dust in the back of my closet. But the strangest thing, the detail that I noticed for years without truly understanding, was how my father treated his own father. He didn't argue with Grandpa Walter. He simply erased him. When Meridian had company picnics, or holiday galas, or when my father finally made vice president and rented out the entire top floor of a downtown steakhouse to celebrate, Grandpa was never invited. Not once. I asked my dad about it exactly one time, during Thanksgiving dinner when I was 25. I asked why Grandpa hadn't been at his promotion dinner. My father's face closed up like a heavy metal garage door coming down. "Some worlds shouldn't mix, Hannah," he said. That was the whole answer. It would be 4 more years before I understood what he was so afraid of, and by then, the invitations had my own name printed on them. Ethan Cole proposed to me right on my mail route, which is honestly the most beautiful and fitting thing anyone has ever done for me. He teaches 11th grade American history at the local high school. He laughs at his own terrible jokes about half a second before anyone else does, and on a drizzly Tuesday afternoon in April, he was waiting for me at the very last mailbox on Cedar Crest Drive. He was holding a small velvet box like it was a registered letter that required my signature. I said yes before he could even finish the sentence. We wanted a simple wedding. We booked Marigold Hall in Dayton, a beautiful old brick building with high ceilings and creaky wood floors that had once been a neighborhood social club. We planned for 200 guests, a local country band, my grandfather sitting at the head table in his best suit, and a modest honeymoon to northern Michigan that we could pay for entirely in cash. Then came the engagement dinner in Columbus. My mother insisted on hosting, setting the table with the hand-painted china that no one in our family had ever actually been allowed to eat off of without a lecture on its provenance. After the salad plates were cleared, my father did what he always does when he wants to establish control. He slid a crisp white envelope across the linen tablecloth like a corporate executive closing a hostile takeover. Inside was a cashier's check for $30,000. So it's done properly, my father said, leaning back in his chair and taking a slow sip of his wine. My mother reached across the table and touched my wrist, her smile perfectly straight. Think of it as staging, honey, she said. Weddings are like listings. Presentation is everything. I want to be completely honest with you here, because this is the moment where I let myself make the first mistake. I hesitated. I had been managing my parents my entire life, translating their coldness for my friends, smoothing down their sharp edges, and some tired, weak part of me thought, just take the check, Hannah. Keep the peace. You know how they are. It's $30,000. It will make the day easier. So, I looked at Ethan, who was watching me with a quiet, supportive look that told me he would back whatever I chose, and I said thank you. I told my dad that we would accept it, but only as a gift, not a vote on how the day was run. My father smiled, a quick, practiced movement of his lips, and agreed far too quickly. And then, while my mother went to the kitchen to fetch the dessert plates, he slid a second item across the table. It was a heavy, black leather folder monogrammed with his initials, the exact kind of folder he carried into quarterly board reviews at Meridian. Just a few thoughts, he said, on the guest list. I opened the folder, expecting to see the names of distant cousins or old family friends from my childhood. What I found instead was a detailed corporate organizational chart with seating assignments. My father's guest list had 26 names on it, and I had never shared a single meal, or even a conversation, with any of them. There were regional directors, 2 senior vice presidents, the head of logistics for the entire Midwest corridor, and at the very top of the hierarchy, underlined twice in black ink, was Raymond Whitfield, the chief executive officer of Meridian Freight Systems. In the span of a single appetizer, my wedding had been converted into a corporate networking event. It took me a full week of phone calls to understand the real reason behind my father's sudden generosity. Meridian's senior vice president of global operations had announced his retirement in March. The chair was still warm, the search committee was active, and my father had spent 20 long years positioning himself exactly one rung below that office. A daughter's wedding was the single event where he could put a CEO, the entire board of directors, and his own last name in the same room, under the guise of family, and make a pitch for his own advancement. I did what I had always done. I managed it. I gave up the local country band I wanted because my mother told me that fiddles made us look like we were hosting a county fair. I gave up my neighborhood florist because my mother had a girl in North Columbus who did high-end modern arrangements with structural twigs and white orchids. I told myself that each surrender was small, that peace was worth more than centerpieces, and that as long as Ethan and I were married at the end of the day, the rest was just background noise. Ethan watched me negotiate away my own wedding, one polite voicemail at a time, until he finally sat me down on our sofa one night and said gently, "Hannah, you keep calling it their event." Is it? I laughed it off, but the laugh felt hollow in my chest. Then, the formal seating chart arrived in my inbox. My mother emailed it on a Sunday night at 11 o'clock, color-coded and professionally rendered in a PDF file that looked like an architectural blueprint. The Meridian executives were fanned out around the dance floor, positioned like a protective security detail around the head table. I found Ethan's parents, 2 retired public school teachers who had spent their lives working with special education students, placed at a side table near the kitchen doors. I found my college roommate and her husband seated next to the restrooms. And then, I found my grandfather. The man who had taught me how to ride a double-wheeler bike in the empty parking lot of Garfield Elementary, the man who had dried my tears when my mother called to say they couldn't make it down for my middle school graduation, was placed at table 14. It was in the far back corner, directly next to the swinging kitchen doors, behind a thick plaster pillar where the photographer's lenses literally could not reach him. I didn't wait until morning. I called my mother immediately. I kept my voice perfectly level, because level is the only language that works on Linda Brooks. If you show emotion, she uses it as leverage. I told her that Grandpa raised me, and that he was sitting at the head table. My mother let out a long, slow sigh, the exact sigh she uses on first-time homebuyers who want granite countertops on a laminate budget. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth, "the head table is for the wedding party and the hosts. And your father and I are hosting. It's just cleaner this way." Cleaner. I wrote that word down on the back of an old utility envelope sitting on my counter, pressing the pen so hard into the paper that the ballpoint tore through the cardboard. I wrote it down so I would never forget the sound of her voice when she said it. When I drove over to my grandfather's house the next evening, he was out on the porch, oiling the brass hinges of his screen door with a small blue can of 3-in-1 oil. In Walter Brooks's world, a squeak in a door was not just an annoyance, it was a minor moral failing. I sat down on the wooden steps, breathing in the smell of the oil and the freshly cut grass of his small lawn, and I told him about Table 14. I was ready to be angry for both of us. I was ready to storm Columbus and throw the $30,000 check back into their white quart sink. Grandpa just stopped squeezing the oil can. He wiped his hands slowly on the red shop rag that always lived in his back pocket, sat down on the steps next to me, and patted my knee with his calloused, heavy hand. "I've sat in worse seats, kiddo," he said, his voice quiet and steady. "Don't go burning down your family over a piece of wood and some folding chairs. It's not worth the smoke." That was the thing about my grandfather. He was 78 years old, and in my entire life, I had never once heard him fight for his own dignity. I used to think, when I was younger and angrier, that he simply didn't know how to stand up for himself. It never occurred to me that a man could be so entirely certain of his own worth that he didn't need a room full of people in ties to vote on it. Before I left his house that night, I went into his small hallway to use the restroom, and I noticed his dark wool suit hanging on the closet door. It was fresh from the cleaners, still encased in thin plastic, with the brown leather dress shoes he polished himself lined up perfectly underneath the hem. Once a year, every single year since I was a little girl, Grandpa would put on that exact suit, shine those exact shoes, and go downtown for what he always referred to as his annual pension meeting. He had been gone all afternoon that previous Thursday, and when he came home, he had a heavy, silver ballpoint pen sitting in his breast pocket. It was engraved with a tiny, delicate compass rose. I remember looking at it and thinking it looked incredibly expensive for a public school district pension office, but I didn't ask. In our family, we let quiet men have their quiet routines. If you want to understand why my father is the way he is, you have to go back to a high school cafeteria in the winter of 1984. I only know about this because of my Aunt Carol, my father's older sister, who is the only member of that side of the family who still speaks to me without a corporate filter. Over coffee at a diner near the post office that week, while she was gently trying to coax me into being more flexible about the wedding arrangements, she let the story slip. My father was 12 years old. Grandpa Walter was the head maintenance man at the old Harlan trucking depot back then, and in a town as small as Dayton was back then, everyone knew exactly who swept the floors. One afternoon during lunch, a table of boys whose fathers wore suits to work decided to have some fun at my dad's expense. They took a filthy, grease-soaked rag from the custodian's cart in the hallway, soaked it in the water fountain, and dropped it right onto my father's lunch tray, landing directly on his sandwich. One of the boys leaned in close and said, loud enough for the whole cafeteria to hear, "Looks like your dad missed a spot, Richard." Carol told me the entire room erupted into laughter. She said my father didn't cry, and he didn't fight. He just stood up, left his tray on the table, walked 3 miles home in the freezing sleet, threw his ruined school coat at Grandpa's feet like an accusation, and begged him to get a different job. Any job. A job with a desk. A job where he didn't have to wear a blue work shirt with his name embroidered on the pocket. And my grandfather, who had a mortgage, 2 young children, and a wife whose health was already starting to fail, looked at his son and said the only thing he knew how to say. "Work is work, Richard." Carol swore to me that my father never forgave him for that sentence. He spent the next 40 years mowing lawns, working 3 jobs through college, and climbing the corporate ladder at Meridian with a desperate, white-knuckled intensity, all to ensure that no one could ever drop a wet rag on his lunch tray again. I sat in that diner, looking at my cold coffee, and my heart absolutely ached for the 12-year-old boy my father had been. But then I looked out the window at my mail truck parked at the curb, and I realized that the 12-year-old boy was 54 years old now, and the man he was still throwing rags at was his own 78-year-old father. That Sunday, my mother sent a text to the family group chat. "Family meeting at our house," it read. "We need to discuss wedding presentation." The family meeting had a slide deck. I wish with everything in me that I was exaggerating, but I am not. I drove the 70 miles from Dayton to Columbus, walked into their pristine kitchen, and sat at the marble island while my father clicked through a presentation titled Brooks Cole Wedding Run of Show. The tiny compass rose logo of Meridian Freight Systems was ghosted into the bottom corner of every single slide like a professional watermark. There was a timeline for the arrivals. There was a detailed photo protocol, which listed exactly which family groupings were approved for the formal portraits. And then, near the very end, came a slide titled Seating Optics. My father set the presentation clicker down on the counter and spoke to me in the exact tone he uses when he is addressing a regional manager whose terminal numbers are slipping. He explained that Raymond Whitfield would be seated 14 feet from the head table. He said that every senior director in the Midwest would have a direct line of sight to my chair. And then he looked at me, his eyes cold and perfectly flat, and said, "We cannot have a retired public school janitor sitting at the head table, Hannah." That is the story the company tells on Monday morning. That is the only story that matters. I looked at him, and then I looked my mother, who was busily examining the quartz of her kitchen counter as if she had suddenly discovered a fascinating new mineral pattern in the stone. I said, "Grandpa sits at the head table." My voice didn't shake, and I was incredibly proud of that, because my hands under the counter were trembling so badly I had to lock them between my knees. My father looked at me like I was a ledger line that simply wouldn't reconcile. Then, he said the sentence that I know he had been rehearsing in his office, in his car, and in his head for his entire adult life. "People remember the mop, Hannah, not the man." I stood up, picked up my car keys, and told them that the seating chart was no longer open for discussion. As I walked toward the front door, my father's voice followed me down the hallway, as calm and predictable as a winter weather forecast. "Then you'd better hope nobody at that reception asks him what he did for a living," he said. I sat in my car in their driveway for 10 full minutes before I trusted my hands enough to put the key in the ignition. If you have ever had to explain to your own parents why the person who raised you deserves a seat at your table, please tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one of them during my lunch breaks, parked in my mail truck on the side of the road, and if you are staying with me through this, please subscribe. Because what my parents did at our rehearsal dinner still makes my throat tight, and what a stranger in a much better suit did 48 hours later changed every single thing my family believed about itself. My mother doesn't argue in the open, she campaigns in the shadows. Within 48 hours of that kitchen meeting, my phone had turned into a corporate switchboard. Aunt Carol called me first, but the warmth from our diner date was completely gone, replaced by rehearsed talking points. "Hannah, your father has worked 20 years for this opening," she said, her voice sounding thin through the speaker. 20 years. It's just one dinner. It's one evening of your grandfather sitting somewhere quiet and comfortable. Don't cost your father his shot at that VP chair over pride. I asked her if she remembered the story about the high school cafeteria. She went quiet, then whispered that it was different, though she couldn't explain how, and suddenly remembered she had a casserole in the oven that needed tending. My cousin Beth texted me a long paragraph about the importance of keeping the peace for the older generation, which I found deeply ironic considering the older generation in question was currently being hidden behind a plaster pillar so he wouldn't ruin the corporate aesthetic. Even our family pastor received a friendly, exploratory phone call from Linda Brooks, asking if there was a way to streamline the family elements of the service to keep things moving quickly. The pastor told me about the call with a raised eyebrow during our premarital counseling, and to his eternal credit, he let the request die right there on his desk. By Friday morning, I understood the exact shape of the trap they were setting. My parents weren't just lobbying for a seating chart, they were systematically recruiting witnesses from within our own family. They wanted to make sure that when I finally gave in, it would look like a family consensus rather than a total surrender. And here is the part that scares me to admit, it was working. When every single phone call you receive for a week tells you that you are the one being difficult, that you are the one ruining your father's career, you start doing some very dangerous math on your own heart. You start wondering if maybe you are the selfish one. Then, Ethan came home from school on Tuesday afternoon and mentioned, far too casually, that his mother had received a call from mine. Apparently, my mother had called to discuss the rehearsal dinner menu and had dropped a few polite, pointed suggestions about the correct volume of the groom's family during the toasts. Ethan's parents are retired public school teachers who still live in the same modest house where they raised 3 boys. My mother had treated them like an underperforming listing that needed to be cleaned up before the open house. That was the night the math stopped. That Sunday, Ethan's parents invited us all over for Sunday roast, and they specifically sent a handwritten invitation to my grandfather, because Nancy Cole is a woman who believes in the dignity of a first-class stamp. I sat in their cozy, crowded living room and watched my grandfather walk into a house he had never set foot in before, and he was treated like a visiting foreign dignitary. Ethan's father spent 40 minutes getting Walter's opinion on a sagging gutter on the garage. His mother insisted on hearing the story of the Great Blizzard of 1978 again, laughing until her eyes teared up at his descriptions of the snowdrifts. At some point during the afternoon, the screen door on their back porch started catching on the frame. Grandpa had his small toolkit out of his truck and had the entire thing repaired, planed, and swinging silently within 10 minutes. Nobody was embarrassed. Nobody apologized for the dust on his trousers. And I sat there with a dinner roll in my hand, realizing with a sudden, sharp pain in my chest that I had never once seen my grandfather look that relaxed at my parents' table in 22 years. On the drive home that night, Ethan looked over at me as we stopped at a red light. "The father-daughter dance," he said quietly. "What are you going to do?" I stared out at the dark road. Because here is the truth that I hadn't been brave enough to say out loud, I was still planning to dance with my father. Tradition is a heavy thing when you've been trained to carry it. You only get one father, Hannah, I told Ethan, mostly to hear how it sounded. He let the silence stretch out in the car for a long time before he spoke. "Sure," he said. "And who was the one who actually taught you how to dance?" I didn't answer him, because the answer was a small kitchen in Dayton on a rainy Tuesday evening when I was 11 years old. My parents had canceled another weekend visit because of a real estate convention in Chicago, and my grandfather had turned on an old transistor radio on top of the refrigerator, kicked back the kitchen rug, and stood me on his shoe tops, counting 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, while we spun around the linoleum. I turned up the car radio to drown out the memory, and Ethan, who is wise enough to know when a fact needs time to finish its work in a person's head, let me have the silence. The next morning, my mother called me to talk about my final dress fitting. At the very end of the call, she mentioned that she had finalized the official family photo list with the photographer. She read the names off her screen, her voice brisk and efficient. It took me until she reached the end of the list to notice the one name that wasn't there. Grandpa Walter was not on the family photo schedule. That missing name was the tremor before the earthquake, because later that afternoon, I discovered what my parents' $30,000 check had actually purchased. I called our caterer to ask about swapping the fish course for a vegetarian option, and there was a long, puzzled pause on the other end of the line. "Oh, we'll need Mrs. Brooks to approve any changes," the coordinator said. "She's the primary signer on the contract now." The signer. While I had been delivering mail and trying to manage my family's feelings, my mother had quietly gone behind my back, upgraded the entire catering package to a high-end French menu, paid the difference, and re-signed the contract in her own name. She had done the exact same thing with the photographer, whose new invoice listed a second shooter dedicated entirely to taking candid photographs of the corporate guests. It wasn't theft. It was much neater than theft. It was the ancient rule of real estate: whoever signs the contract owns the property. My mother had lived by that rule her entire career, and I had simply never imagined that I would be the property. I sat at my kitchen table that night with every single wedding document I possessed. Ethan was grading essays across from me, and I began sorting the papers the way I sort the mail on my route every morning, ruthlessly, and by zip code. Florist? Signed by my mother. Caterer? Signed by my mother. Photographer? Signed by my mother. And then, at the very bottom of the heavy pile, I found the contract for Marigold Hall. We had booked it 11 months ago. The deposit had been paid from my own personal checking account, using money I had earned walking 12 miles a day in the sleet and the rain. There was only one signature on the bottom line of that lease. Mine. I placed my index finger on the ink and left it there for a very long time. My parents had bought the flowers, the food, and the photographs. But they had not bought the room. Ethan looked up from his red grading pen, saw the expression on my face, and smiled slowly. "You've got that route look," he said. "What route look?" I asked. "The one you get when there's a loose dog on the porch but you're going to deliver the letter anyway," he said. I slept better that night than I had in 3 weeks. The next morning, I drove over to my grandfather's house to tell him what I was going to do, but before I could get the words out, he sat me down at the kitchen table and made me an offer that broke my heart a little. He poured me a cup of black coffee, sat opposite me, and slid a folded, yellowed piece of paper across the old wood. It was a savings account statement from a local credit union. "I have a little something put by," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Take it, kiddo. Use it for the hall, or the food, or whatever you need. No strings attached. Strings are your parents' hobby, not mine." I looked down at the balance on the paper. It was a modest sum, built slowly over 40 years of sweeping floors and clearing snow, and it was exactly what you would expect from a man who still darns his own socks to save $1. I couldn't speak for a moment because my throat had completely closed up. A man who had worked 45 years in blue work shirts was offering to empty his entire life's drawer just so his granddaughter could have a party. I pushed the paper back to him and told him no. I told him that his only job at my wedding was to put on his good suit, sit exactly where I put him, and save me a dance if his bad knee allowed for it. He grumbled that his knee was perfectly fine, which we both knew was a flat-out lie. On my way out of his house, I stopped in the hallway to look at the crooked line of framed photographs that had hung there since I was a child. There was Grandma Ruth in her blue Easter hat, there was a clipping from the Dayton paper of me standing next to my mail truck on my first day of work, and then there was one photo I had walked past 10,000 times without ever truly looking at. It was a black and white picture of a young man who was unmistakably my grandfather. He was wiry, grinning, and standing next to the massive chrome cab of a vintage commercial truck with Harlan Trucking painted on the door in elegant script. But he wasn't holding a mop or a broom in the photo. He was holding a large, rolled-up cylinder of paper, big sheets curled like architectural blueprints, and there was a heavy carpenter's pencil tucked behind his ear. "Grandpa," I called out, "what is this photo from?" He came out of the kitchen, holding his coffee cup, and stood next to me, staring at the photo for a long, quiet moment. "I kept their floors clean," he said at last, his voice dropping an octave. "And a few other things." Then he asked if I wanted another slice of peach pie in the exact tone of voice that meant the subject was officially closed. I let it close. But 3 weeks later, in the middle of a crowded ballroom, I would remember the pencil behind his ear. On a Tuesday afternoon, 2.5 weeks before the wedding, I took a vacation day and drove Grandpa Walter to Garfield Elementary. He still volunteered there one morning a month, repairing the wooden cubbies and fixing the leaky water fountains that the school district's tight budget couldn't cover. I hadn't stepped inside that building since the day I graduated 6th grade. The hallways felt incredibly small, the way childhood hallways always do when you grow up, but as I walked behind my grandfather, I got to witness something I had been far too young to understand the first time around. I saw the way that school treated Walter Brooks. The office staff didn't just greet him, their faces lit up the moment he opened the door. The retired cook, Miss Dorothy, who still came in on Tuesdays to run the school's weekend food pantry, ran out from behind her counter, threw her arms around him, and called him Mr. Brooks in the exact, reverent tone of voice that people usually save for cardiac surgeons. A young custodian, 30 years my grandfather's junior, followed him down the hall like a medical resident on rounds, hanging on every piece of advice Walter gave him about the boilers. And right there, over the door of the old custodian's workshop, laminated and faded by 30 years of fluorescent light, was a simple strip of paper in my grandfather's neat, block printing, "Leave every room better than you found it." He taped that there for the kids, Dorothy whispered to me as we watched him work on a copper pipe. The teachers still point to it when the classrooms get messy. While Grandpa was busy rewiring a water fountain, Dorothy fed me coffee cake and school gossip in the teacher's lounge. And then she let slip a detail that immediately caught in my mind. "You know about the day he dresses up every year, don't you?" she asked, leaning in close. I nodded, telling her I knew about his annual pension meeting. Dorothy laughed, a rich, rolling sound. "Pension meeting?" "Hannah, a black town car comes to his house to pick him up. A driver in a full suit opens the door for him. The first time I saw it, I ran out of my house and asked him who had died. And Walter just laughed and said, 'Nobody, Dorothy. Some old paperwork just refuses to stay in its drawer. A town car for a school district custodian's pension.'" I chewed my coffee cake and filed that information into the drawer of my mind where you put things that don't make sense, waiting for the rest of the pieces to arrive. Then I looked out the window at the schoolyard, thought about the sign over the custodian's door, and made the decision I had been avoiding for a month. It was time to leave my own family's room a little better than I had found it. The next morning, I drove to Columbus with a manila envelope of my own. My parents' kitchen island is made of white Italian quartz, costing $4,000, a detail I know because my mother has managed to work the price into every holiday conversation since they've remodeled. I laid my envelope down on that quartz. Inside was their $30,000 check, entirely intact, undeposited, and 3 months old. Along with it was a single, typed page detailing what I was canceling. The upgraded French catering was gone. The corporate photographer with the second shooter was gone. The North Columbus florist with the modern fern wall was gone. What I was keeping was Marigold Hall, whose lease still bore my signature, and every single promise I had made to the people I actually loved. My father read the page like it was a corporate liquidation notice. My mother stared at the cashier's check like it was a death certificate. "You can't afford this wedding, Hannah," she said, her voice dropping all of its professional warmth. I looked her in the eye. I told her that the new wedding would be one that Ethan and I could pay for ourselves, which was exactly the point of weddings back when they actually worked. Nobody yelled. We don't yell in our family. We just adjust our financial forecasts and withdraw our support. I drove the 70 miles back to Dayton with the car radio off and my spine perfectly straight. That night, I sat at my own kitchen table with an $11 calligraphy pen I'd bought at an art store, and I did the small, quiet thing that, looking back, was the first real shot of the war. I hand-lettered the place cards for the head table. I saved my grandfather's card for last. I used my absolute best lettering, brown ink on heavy cream cardstock, and when it was dry, I set it upright on the windowsill above my kitchen sink where I would see it every single morning. Walter Brooks. Head table. It is a strange thing to arm yourself with nothing but cardstock, but every morning while my coffee brewed, that little tent of paper stood there like a fence post. I would read his name, take a deep breath, and go deliver the mail. On Thursday afternoon, my father's voicemail arrived. It was exactly 11 seconds long, flat and cold as a shipping manifest. "You are embarrassing us in front of the most important people in my life, Hannah," he said. I replayed the message 3 times, struck by the fact that he hadn't even noticed what he had just ranked. Here is what a wedding looks like when you return $30,000 to people who keep score. The live corporate band became a retired music teacher named Gloria, who played the hall's old upright piano, which had been tuned on a Saturday afternoon by a man who owed my grandfather a personal favor from 1998. The expensive white orchid wall became hundreds of yellow garden roses, cut fresh from 3 different backyards on my mail route. When the elderly ladies I had delivered letters to for 7 years heard that my wedding had lost its florist, they volunteered their gardens like it was a neighborhood mobilization effort. Miss Dorothy from the school food pantry took over the catering dap for the cocktail hour, and the local ladies baked enough lemon bars and pies to support an entire denomination. Was I sad about any of it? I keep checking that pocket of my heart, and every time, I find it completely empty of regret. My mother, however, was sad enough for both of us. Without us, Hannah, it's just a neighborhood potluck, not a wedding, she told me over the phone, her voice taking on that silky, dangerous quality she uses right before she walked away from a stubborn listing. You know, your father and I have been seriously asking ourselves whether we can even attend an event like this. There it was. The final card in their deck, played casually like an afterthought. Their own attendance. I told her I hoped they would be there, and I meant it, and I absolutely hated myself for meaning it. We hung up on a silence that had teeth. 2 days later, an RSVP card arrived in my own mailbox, which made me smile, a mail carrier getting her own mail. It was printed on heavy, cream cardstock, filled out with a confident, dark fountain pen. Mr. Raymond Whitfield accepts with pleasure. The chief executive officer of Meridian Freight Systems was coming to my neighborhood potluck. I stood by my mailbox, laughing out loud, and then realized with a cold shock that my father had invited the one guest he absolutely could not afford to be absent in front of. Whatever my parents had decided about boycotting my wedding, that cream RSVP card had just decided it for them. They had to show up. My father called me on Sunday night, his corporate negotiating voice fully active. It was all warm leather and executive charm. He told me he had been thinking, and he wanted to offer a practical path forward. Option A, he said. Grandpa Walter attends the ceremony at the church. The church is fine. Churches are naturally humble places. And then, he quietly skips the reception. He hates crowds anyway, Hannah. He'd be relieved. Option B, he continued. Grandpa comes to the reception, but we move him to table 14, reframed now as a matter of convenience and comfort. It's near the exit, Hannah. The man is 78. He'll want to leave early anyway. I sat on my back porch steps, listening to my father redesign his own deep-seated shame as if it were an act of family chivalry, and I had to give him credit. It was a much better draft than his last one. When he finished speaking, I took a slow breath. He doesn't dislike crowds, Dad, I said. He dislikes being hidden. Those are two very different things. There was a long pause on the line, and when my father spoke again, his voice was quieter, the corporate leather completely worn off. You don't understand what one dinner can cost a man, he whispered. He was closer to being honest in that single sentence than he had been in my entire life. Part of me wanted to meet him there, to ask him about the cafeteria in 1984, to tell him that the boys who threw the grease rag on his tray were gone, and that his father had spent 40 years sweeping floors just to keep him safe. But then I looked through the kitchen window at my grandfather's name card sitting on the windowsill, and I knew that if I met my father in his shame, I would be leaving my grandfather outside in the cold. I told him the seating chart was already printed, and I hung up the phone. The rehearsal at the church was a disaster of cold shoulders and missed cues. My mother stood in the back of the sanctuary, wearing her sunglasses indoors, while my father stood near the altar, refusing to look at my grandfather, who was sitting quietly in the third pew, holding his good hat in his lap. During the walk-through, my father deliberately walked 3 feet out of his way to avoid passing Walter in the aisle. After the third time he did it, Grandpa looked up at me, gave me a tiny, reassuring wink, and went back to studying the woodwork of the altar. The confrontation in the church dressing room happened immediately after the walkthrough ended. The pastor had gone to his office, and the wedding party was dispersing, when my parents cornered me. Take him off the head table, Hannah, my father said, his face pale and his fists clenched tightly at his sides. Or we leave right now. We won't be there on Saturday. I looked at my mother, looking for any sign of hesitation, but her face was as solid as her $4,000 quartz counter. I reached into my bag, pulled out the hand-lettered place card for table 1, and held it out to my father. "If you don't want to sit next to him, Dad," I said, "you can sit at table 14. It's right near the exit." My father stared at the card, his face turning a deep, dark red. He didn't take it. He turned on his heel, grabbed my mother by the elbow, and walked straight out of the church, their heavy leather shoes clicking loudly on the stone floor of the foyer. They didn't show up for the rehearsal dinner at the local diner. We ate our hamburgers and drank our milkshakes without them, and if there was a hollow space at the table, my grandfather filled it by showing Ethan's brothers how to balance a salt shaker on its rim using 3 grains of pepper. The morning of the wedding was perfectly clear and cool, the kind of autumn day that makes you feel like the air itself has been scrubbed clean. Marigold Hall was filled with the smell of 300 backyard roses and the sweet, rich scent of Miss Dorothy's lemon bars. My parents did show up. They arrived exactly 10 minutes before the ceremony started, slipping into the parents' pew in the front row. They looked pristine, expensive, and entirely hollowed out. They didn't look at me as I walked down the aisle, and during the ceremony, my father kept his eyes fixed strictly on the stained glass window above the altar, as if he were trying to calculate the replacement value of the lead came. But when we walked into the reception hall, the atmosphere shifted. The tables were filled with our neighbors, my mail route customers, Ethan's fellow teachers, and a small, tight group of my grandfather's old friends from the school district. And right there, at the center table in front of the upright piano, sat Grandpa Walter in his clean wool suit, his shoes polished to a high mirror shine, and his hand-lettered place card sitting proudly in front of his water glass. My parents sat at the head table because their corporate pride wouldn't allow them to be seen sitting anywhere else once the guests began to arrive. But they sat as far from my grandfather as the table allowed, speaking only to each other in quiet, clipped whispers. And then, at exactly 6:30, the heavy double doors of Marigold Hall opened, and Raymond Whitfield walked into the room. The CEO of Meridian Freight Systems looked exactly like a man who ran a 12,000-employee corporation. He wore a dark, perfectly tailored charcoal suit, a silver tie, and he had a presence that immediately drew the eyes of every corporate ladder climber in the room. My father's head snapped up the moment Whitfield stepped across the threshold. I watched my father stand up so quickly he nearly knocked his water glass over. He smoothed his jacket, adjusted his tie, and began walking toward the door, his face twisting into his most practiced, professional smile. He extended his hand, preparing his best, most polished welcoming remarks. Raymond Whitfield walked right past my father. He didn't even see my dad's outstretched hand. His eyes had scanned the room, passed over the corporate directors who were waving from their tables, and locked onto the head table. Specifically, they locked onto the elderly man sitting next to my empty bridal chair. Whitfield's face changed instantly. The cold, corporate distance disappeared, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. He buttoned his jacket with a quick, decisive movement and walked rapidly across the ballroom floor, straight toward my grandfather. "Walter?" he said, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of Gloria's piano music. "Walter Brooks." My grandfather looked up from his water glass, smiled his quiet, slow smile, and stood up, extending his calloused hand. "Hello, Raymond," he said. "It's been a while." Raymond Whitfield took my grandfather's hand in both of his, shaking it with a deep, reverent respect that I had never seen a corporate executive show to anyone in my entire life. "I had no idea this was your granddaughter, Walter," the CEO said, his voice thick with genuine emotion. "If I had known, I would have sent a car for you myself." My father was standing 3 feet away, his hands still frozen halfway in the air, his face completely bloodless. He looked like a man who had walked into his own home and found the furniture floating 3 feet off the floor. "Raymond," my father stammered, his voice thin and high. You know my father?" Raymond Whitfield turned to my father, his eyes cooling down to that sharp, professional edge. "Know him? Richard, if it weren't for your father, Meridian Freight Systems wouldn't have a Midwest corridor to operate." The room went entirely silent. Even Gloria had stopped playing the piano, her hands hovering over the keys. Whitfield turned back to the crowd, looking at my grandfather with a smile that was entirely genuine. Back in 1976, he said, when Harlan Trucking was facing total bankruptcy during the shipping crisis, it was Walter Brooks who designed the automated loading routing system that cut our transit times in half. He didn't just sweep the floors at the Dayton Depot, Richard. He patented the entire logistics layout that we still use today in every single one of our hubs. The CEO looked around the room, his eyes landing on the beautiful, hand-picked backyard roses and the plates of homemade pies. When the merger happened in '88, Walter refused a corporate VP seat because he wanted to stay in Dayton to raise his family and keep his hands dirty. But he negotiated a deal that kept his patent rights intact. Walter is the largest private trust shareholder remaining from the Harlan days, Richard. He's the reason our board has to come to Dayton every year just to renew our primary hub leases. I stood there, holding Ethan's hand, and suddenly every single piece of the puzzle fell into its perfect, devastating place. The silver pen with the compass rose. The town car that arrived every Thursday in October. The blueprints my grandfather was holding in the old black and white photo on his hallway wall. The annual pension meeting was the private trustees' audit, and the CEO of a 12,000-person corporation had to personally present the company's books to a retired school janitor because that janitor held the keys to their entire physical infrastructure. My father looked at my grandfather, his mouth opening and closing silently, his 40 years of carefully built shame evaporating into the warm autumn air of a Dayton social hall. He had spent his entire adult life running away from a man he thought was too small for his table, only to discover that his father was the very giant whose shoulders he had been standing on to reach the sky. Raymond Whitfield looked at my grandfather, and then he looked down at the hand-lettered place card sitting on the head table, Walter Brooks, head table. The CEO took a long, quiet measure of my father's pale, terrified face, and then looked at me and Ethan. "You've got a beautiful room here, Hannah," Whitfield said, his voice carrying that heavy weight of corporate authority that doesn't need to shout to be heard. "It's clear you know exactly how to treat the people who built your foundation." My father tried to speak, to offer some kind of explanation, some polished corporate spin to save his promotion, but Whitfield simply raised his hand, a small, polite movement that cut my father off instantly. "We'll discuss the regional operations chair on Monday, Richard," the CEO said, his voice perfectly level. "But I have to tell you, I've always believed that a man who doesn't respect his own foundation can't be trusted to build ours." The rest of the evening is a blur of warm music, laughter, and the smell of sweet peach pie. My parents stayed for the toasts, but they sat in a quiet, stunned silence, looking like two people who had survived a shipwreck but had no idea which country they had washed up on. They left before the cake was cut, slipping out the back door near the kitchen, the exact exit my father had recommended for my grandfather. But before they left, my father paused near the double doors, looking back at the head table. I was sitting there, laughing at something Ethan had said, while my grandfather was showing the CEO of Meridian Freight Systems how to properly grease a sticky screen door hinge using a drop of oil from a blue can he'd found in his truck. My father's eyes met mine for one final, fleeting second, and for the first time in 29 years, I didn't see the scoreboard in them. I just saw a 12-year-old boy who had finally realized that nobody was looking at the mop. I didn't seek revenge on my parents. When my father's promotion went to a regional manager from Indianapolis 3 weeks later, I didn't call to gloat. I didn't send them photos of the wedding, and I didn't remind them of the $30,000 they had lost. I simply set a boundary. I let them live in the pristine, quiet world they had built for themselves in Columbus, and I stayed in my quiet world in Dayton, where the people on my route know my name and the screen doors swing without a squeak. My grandfather passed away 2 years ago, peaceful as a Sunday morning, in the same small ranch house where he raised me. When we cleared out his things, we found his dark wool suit hanging on the closet door, fresh from the cleaners, and inside the pocket of his good trousers was the hand-lettered place card from our wedding, the corner slightly creased from where he had kept it in his breast pocket. If there is one thing I learned from the man who swept the floors of Garfield Elementary, it's that you don't need to build a glass tower to prove that you exist. You don't need to put your name on a billboard to show your worth. You just have to do honest work, love the people who share your table, and leave every single room just a little bit better than you found it. Thank you for listening to this chapter of our story. If this brought a little warmth to your day, please share it with someone who needs to hear it, leave a comment about your own quiet heroes below, and don't forget to subscribe to Hidden Chapters for more stories about the secrets we carry and the truths that set us free. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and keep standing your ground.